Welcome to Overcoming the Odds, African American entrepreneurs, pioneers, the Underground Railroad, and the continual march toward equality. Celeste Leslie and I, Zaltha Ellis, along with others of the African American Historical Society of South Central Pennsylvania, will be narrating for you today. The presentation is about 1 hour and 20 minutes. You may stop and be started as time allows. Although this presentation is free of charge, we ask that you please make a goodwill contribution to the African American Historical Society of South Central Pennsylvania. We have a lot of work to do and operating expenses that we must meet. At the end of the presentation, we will give you information about how you can donate. The story of Lancaster is complete only when it includes the voices and historical records of the African Americans who navigated a shifting legal, social, and political environment. And we would like to share this history with you today. The panorama of Lancaster provides a rich visual record of the Lancaster at the turn of the century. If we look closely, it can give you first impressions of Lancaster. What are the three features of the city that you notice? If you notice church steeples, they could indicate that people worship in this city and that they have Christian values of love, service, etc. If you notice farmland, it could indicate that people who live here are hardworking and that rich farmland yields an abundance of food. If you notice fences, they could represent a belief in the value of owning property and respecting the rights of others. First impressions, however, don't reveal the entire story. So as we dig deeper, we will uncover contradictions and complexities. To help you clarify the meaning, we'll present recurring themes to tell you what is important to know. On most slides, you will see symbols in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Similar to symbols on a map, these represent ideas that are important to the times when these stories occurred. The gold star represents the logo of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. It identifies a place with an authentic connection to the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a way for Africans escaping slavery to get north and move closer to freedom. It was a series of places where freedom seekers could find help along the way. The places were houses, barns, boats, and in some places, tents that were called stations. People who traveled the route were called passengers, and people who led and helped Black people to freedom were called conductors. The dollar sign represents entrepreneurs and pioneers, Black people who were able to establish their own businesses, earn their own money, and purchase their homes and properties in spite of the cruel customs that tried to keep them from seceding. They contributed to the economic success of our town and country, and many became wealthy. The footsteps represent their perseverance, grit, and continual march to freedom and equality. Along the way, progress for Black people was always followed by a pushback. The scroll with an X represent cruel laws and customs that were designed to control and keep Black people from earning money and political power. If you would like to determine the meaning of the clasping hands, I would like you to determine the meaning of the clasping hand symbol. At the end of the presentation, I will ask you what theme it represents and on what slides you saw it. Good luck. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our time travel pilot and his biplane, Emery Conrad Malik. The dates on his banner will guide us through the years. As we move through time, you will meet the great niece, Mary Gross, who will tell us about his adventures. And we're pleased to say that other relatives and descendants of other pioneers and entrepreneurs will also be joining us. Our story began in 1780 while the Revolutionary War gripped our nation. Although the war was soon in, the words from the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, did not apply if someone's skin was black or brown. Many white people commonly thought it was acceptable to buy, own, and sell human beings who were brought here against their will and enslaved by force. Sadly, slavery existed throughout Lancaster County at this time. Pennsylvania's geographical location on the Mason-Dixon line, the line dividing the North and the South, created a unique situation in which slavery and freedom stood side by side. The exodus of people escaping slavery was continual, and the Black population in Pennsylvania was growing steadily. Under pressure and duress to end the institution of slavery, the legislature of the state of Pennsylvania passed the Act of Gradual Abolition on March 1st, 1780. The law stated that slavery would end, but gradually. Let's think about this law from different points of view. If you were enslaved, how would you view this law? How would a person who owned slaves view this law? How would abolitionists view this law? Please note the two symbols in the bottom right corner. Why does one symbol have an X on it while the other does not? The law over the long run will end slavery. Over the short run, it did not help those who were enslaved or give hope to the children of the enslaved. Many powerful white people feared that Black people would take their jobs and eventually political power. The mayor of Lancaster and other white community leaders also feared that Black people would take violent revenge for the years of cruelty they and their brethren had suffered. This fear and bias against Black people was the reason that over the next 170 years, many more unjust and bad laws would be written to deny equal rights to all human beings. For sale, this young lady, actually young girl, will be enslaved for another 14 years while she is 28 years old. How would the young girl survive the effects of this law? Because the enslaved felt no immediate relief from the act of gradual abolition, we can understand that many enslaved Black people were fiercely determined to escape and liberate themselves. Slaveholders had the right and authority to chase, kidnap, and return those who escaped their enslavement. To endure their march to freedom, one constant was their own spirituality, their ability to worship, and the church. As we will soon see, churches were not always a refuge for them. This Lutheran church dates back to early 1700s when many of Lancaster's citizens were German. Both ministers and worshipers spoke German. Black people were welcome to worship in this church. However, they were segregated from white people. It was a cruel custom for people to be separated because of the color of their skin. To be free from this cruelty, they wanted to create their own churches, but they knew it would be difficult. Because they were not allowed to congregate without attracting attention and arousing suspicion, Black people realized that they had to ask permission from respectable citizens of the borough or white people to start their own church. To achieve that goal, around 1817, a group of Black people met at the home of Mr. James Clendenham, a prominent Black businessman, to create a plan. 4 years later, in 1821, their new church was built. When it was time to dedicate the new church, this was done by a white pastor from Trinity Lutheran. The new church is now called Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, where both Black and white people worship together. At their pulpits, some ministers in Lancaster spoke out against slavery, and some did not. One minister, Reverend Crotell, was from the Lutheran Church of the Holy Trinity. He spoke against the spread of slavery, but he also had publicly shared his opinion that Black people should return to Africa, even though most of them were born in America. Why do you think some ministers may have had conflicting opinions? Let's take a look at another church, St. James Episcopal Church. St. James Episcopal Church was founded in 1744. The seating plan drawn in 1791 does not reflect the same structure of the 1844 image. The seating chart at St. James Episcopal Church in Lancaster shows the effect of segregation. This is 10 years after the last major battle of the Revolutionary War that was fought to proclaim that all men are created equal. Where are the seats for Black people and servants? By segregating Black people from white people, even in church, the Black population was more easily watched and controlled. Free Black people felt this oppression, not just when they worship, but also in their jobs. In the workplace, their choices were limited. It is about 40 years since the Act of Gradual Abolish was passed, and by the 1820s, less than 1% of the Black population was enslaved in Lancaster. This means that a lot of free Black people were looking for work as they too wanted to prosper and support their families. So they came to Lancaster, perhaps encouraged by family members or friends. The problem was that the mayor feared that these newcomers might have evil plans. They might want to set fires in Lancaster, as others had done in Harrisburg and York a few years before. To take precautions, the mayor instituted the Negro Entry Book. From 1820 until 1849, all free Black people living in Lancaster, as well as those who came to Lancaster, were required to go to the mayor's office and register their names, occupations, and where they were going to live. If they didn't register at the mayor's office, they would have to pay $1 per day until they did. $1 a day was a lot of money at that time. We'll take a closer look at this historical document. This page from the Negro Entry Book, as it was called, gave historians and researchers a lot of information about the free African Americans who entered and lived in Lancaster between 1820 and 1849. The term Negro has been replaced by the words African American. Let's take a look at the skills and talents that James Clendenin brought with him. Please find a few, like painter, glazer, a person who fits glass into windows and doors. Think about how Mr. Clendenin is laying the groundwork for the success of future generations of people of African descent. Mr. Clendenin was one of the wealthiest Black residents in Lancaster. He was an entrepreneur, businessman, and founder of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Lancaster. Please note that Mr. Webster moved into his own house. This is a significant achievement. Mr. Webster later became the first person of African descent to become a sexton in St. James Episcopal Church. A sexton is the person responsible for the maintenance of the property. Think about the effects that Mr. Webster's position in the church had on the white members of the church. Where did Mr. Webster sit when he was in church? Although he had his own seat next to the door, he was required to sit in the back of the church. Now we will take a wider view of the talents, skills, and occupations of other people in the registry. What economic benefits did these Black tradesmen bring to Lancaster? Why are there fewer women with occupations than men? In the first year, 91 people registered their trades and brought approximately 160 people with them. This chart reflects those additional persons in households. The numbers of free Black people whose names were listed in the registry declined steadily. Why are fewer names listed? Perhaps it became too difficult to enforce this law, as tracking people's movement requires a lot of time and effort. It is easy to imagine that resisting this law became easier over time. Most registrants lived in these three neighborhoods that were considered to be outside the downtown area. This 1848 map was created 28 years after the first entry book began recording residents, names, and locations. If you look carefully, the center of the map shows the courthouse that was the central intersection of the city. Meanwhile, the exodus from the south to the north continued, and freedom seekers headed to Pennsylvania. This railroad from Columbia to Philadelphia carried freight as well as human passengers. It offered a faster means of escape from slavery in the South. Before 1834, freedom seekers coming from Maryland and Virginia traveled mostly on foot. Following a dangerous and difficult overland route, they had to continually avoid slave catchers. They wanted to cross the Mason-Dixon line to the free states of Pennsylvania. They were much closer to freedom when they approached the Susquehanna River in Columbia, Pennsylvania. Many of these freedom seekers were given hints that they could find support and refuge in Columbia, Pennsylvania. In order to arrive in Columbia, freedom seekers coming from the South late at night climbed into boats piloted by Black abolitionist Robert Loney. Quietly and secretively, they crossed Susquehanna River. In Columbia, about 150 free Black people lived, worked, and prospered in the Toe Hill community in the years around 1820. Following Loney's instructions, the passengers disembarked and walked in darkness to the Columbia train station. While some freedom seekers may have chosen to remain in Columbia, others were compelled to keep moving. They would soon learn that two wealthy Black men who were abolitionists had a secret way for the travelers to continue their journey. First, some background. Meet Stephen Smith on the left side of your screen. When he was 5 years old, a wealthy man, Mayor Thomas Bowell, who lived in Columbia, Pennsylvania, purchased and indentured Stephen to work for him. Laws allow Major Bowell to do this. As an indentured person, Stephen was forced to work at Bowell's lumberyard to pay off his bound service. And after a certain number of years, he would be free. Major Bowell saw how intelligent Stephen was, so Bowell taught Stephen how to succeed in the lumber business. When he was a young adult, Stephen had been so successful that he was able to buy his own freedom, his wife Harriet Lee's freedom, and purchase Bowell's lumber business. Stephen soon met another successful and wealthy free Black man, Mr. William Whipper, who is pictured on the right. Both Whipper and Smith owned railroad cars that they used to use to transport lumber and other goods along the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad line. In addition to taking their goods to market, the two men used their ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit to support the good cause of abolition. The men decided that they could use their train cars to help Black people escape their bondage and reach freedom. It is possible, but not documented, that abolitionists would be waiting and watching for secret passengers to arrive at the train station where Smith and Whipper's train cars were waiting for them. There, with the help of other abolitionists, such as local resident William Wright, freedom seekers squeezed into the train's car hidden compartments built by Whipper and Smith. In moments, the train left Columbia on its way to its next stop, the train station in the city of Lancaster. Once they disembarked in Lancaster, freedom seekers would be sent to another station or safe house in Lancaster along the Underground Railroad. The train would then head to Philadelphia. After 8 long hours, would arrive at the next destination, Philadelphia. Often in these travel routes, freedom seekers would head to cities further north on the route to Canada, where most people tried to go. Years later, Whipper wrote in a biography that was part of William Still's book, Underground Railroad, that
My house was at the end of the bridge, and as I kept the station, I was frequently called up in the night to take charge of the passengers. On their arrival, they were generally hungry and penniless. I received hundreds in this condition, fed and sheltered from 1 to 17 at a time in a single night. At this point, the road forked. Some I sent west by boats to Pittsburgh, and others in our railroad cars to Philadelphia.
Whipper, who continually supported the cause of abolition, later confessed.
From 1847 to 1860, I contributed from my earnings $1,000 annually.
This was a fortune in those days. One account reports that the system of railroad cars owned by Whipper and Smith was used at least until 1855. No one was ever exposed or apprehended as part of this illegal activity. On the left side of the print is the area where William Whipper lived. The railroad runs in front of the royal homes, hotels, and taverns where there were silver safe houses where freedom seekers could hide after they crossed the river. If you visit Columbia today, a large mural replaces the area where these buildings stood. Why do you think Whipper had to wait so many years to tell this story?
Kidnapped Black women escape from jail. The Fulton Theater that stands today was built on the same stone foundation of the old county workhouse and jail that you see in this sketch. In the jail on that site in 1835, 2 Black women were imprisoned by bounty hunters who were paid to capture former slaves. The women were imprisoned so that in the morning they could be picked up and returned to their masters in North Carolina, where they had been enslaved 2 years earlier. Before they were in jail, Mrs. Ulrich and Mrs. Wallace were living, working, and prospering on farms owned by abolitionists in the southern part of Lancaster County. Abolitionists were people who were against slavery, and many of them were religious people called Quakers. As the women always feared, late one night, a slave catcher kidnapped them and in a horse-drawn wagon took them to jail. Sheriff Dave Miller, known as Daredevil Dave, was a white man and abolitionist who was in charge of the prison where the women were taken. He resisted the 1793 fugitive slave law that required people to arrest suspicious Black people and return them to slavery. He knew that he could be punished for disobeying the law. While the women were in jail, he simply let them escape. It seems that the women kept the secret of their escape for many years so that Sheriff Miller would not be punished for helping them. This way, Daredevil Dave would be able to help other freedom seekers. From the perspective of the white people in power, controlling the lives of Black people was becoming more difficult. The powerful had to tighten their grip. Why don't historians know the birth and death dates of these 2 women? The Fugitive Slave Law, 1850 version, allowed the misery and death of many more Black people to continue. This version, updated from 1793, continued to allow slave catchers to chase, kidnap, and sometimes kill Black people who merely wanted to live peacefully in freedom. The slave catchers, who were also called bounty hunters and man stealers, were paid to do their dreadful deeds. Now we will meet 2 spies who resisted this law. 'The A letter in 1883 Lancaster Inquirer describes a warning that slave catchers were on the way.
Dear sir, I learned that the man-stealers of this place have taken means to obtain authority from Maryland to arrest and take into slavery 2 colored girls who lately lived with you and your brother, Sister Ellen Jackson and Emmeline Raines. They are thought to be now with Whitson. It is said that they belong to William C. Norris, Baltimore. Will you see that they have immediate notice to flee to a city of refuge? They should not stop short of Canada. There is a regular chain of agents and spies of the slaveholders in this and all the adjoining counties. I have spies on the spies, and thus learn these facts. All this, however, must be a secret, or we should lose all advantage which we now have. These are the 8th set of slaves I have warned within a week. I do not doubt that you will attend to the cause of human rights. Yours truly, Thaddeus Stevens.
Let's meet these spies. Edward Rauch, a white man who worked at the courthouse, and Robert Boston, a prosperous, free Black businessman, barber, and later minister, were abolitionists in Lancaster. They worked together to spy on George Hughes, a bounty hunter or slave catcher, who had an office near the square. Hughes, who's not pictured, plotted kidnappings with other bounty hunters who came to town. They shared the bounty or money that they received when they returned slaves to their owners. Because Hughes was illiterate, Rauch would read Hughes' letters to him. This was how Rauch was able to learn when bounty hunters were coming to town to commit their awful deed. Rauch in Boston would then report to Thaddeus Stevens that slave catchers were on the way. Mr. Stevens would send a messenger on horseback to the homes of people who were hiding freedom seekers to let them know that they should quickly move them along their way to the next safe house or a house that kept them safe from slave catchers. The spy's report also was a warning to Stevens and his housekeeper, Mrs. Lydia Hamilton Smith, that they too should be very cautious if they were protecting and hiding people who wanted to be free. These safe houses were all a part of the Underground Railroad, and Rauch, Boston, Stevens, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Smith, were abolitionists and agents on the Underground Railroad. However, before we talk about Mr. Stevens and Mrs. Smith, it is important to learn about another unjust law that allowed slavery to continue in the United States. This law was another example of a powerful backlash that allowed slavery to continue. Dred Scott had been living with his owner in Missouri, a slave-holding state. When the family later moved away to the free territory of Illinois and Wisconsin, Scott accompanied them. When Scott later returned to Missouri with his owner, he sued for his freedom because he had been living in free territory and should no longer be considered a slave. Scott filed a suit for freedom, and the case was sent to the Supreme Court. Robert B. Taney was the 5th Chief Justice of the United States who heard the case. In the case, Scott versus Stanford, Taney ruled that African Americans could not be considered citizens because the Constitution did not apply to Africans and the enslaved. The act allowed discrimination and unequal treatment to all persons of African descent, whether they were free or enslaved. This ruling enraged abolitionists, and shortly after, the Civil War began. Scott and his family were finally manumitted or freed in 1857. He died from tuberculosis 1 year later in 1858. In spite of this setback, the steady march to success in business continued in Lancaster with entrepreneur Thaddeus Henry.
I would like to introduce to you Kathleen Anderson, who will be talking about her ancestor, Mr. Thaddeus Henry.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to tell you about my great-great-grandfather, Thaddeus S. Henry. Thaddeus was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on January 8, 1815. His father, Benjamin, my great-great-great-grandfather, sent him to Lancaster with his uncle, Benjamin Simmons, who was a barber. Thaddeus's dad wanted him to learn a trade and have a different job than he had, which was laboring. He wanted his son to have a chance at a better life. Uncle Benjamin Simmons bought a barber shop in downtown Lancaster from a white barber named Jared Gray. Thaddeus's uncle taught him how to become a skilled barber. Eventually, Uncle Benjamin went back to Philadelphia, and my great-great-grandfather bought the shop. It was on King Street, not far from the center square, that is now called Penn Square. He became a businessman, an entrepreneur who had some control over his time and his income finally. In many newspaper advertisements and clips, my great-great-grandfather is called a tonsorial artist. Tonsorial is another name, another term that is used for a barber. But the tonsorial artists were the top of the line of barbers. In my research, I found that a tonsorial artist may have used different styles and techniques and procedures on their customers. In New York, in an article about a New York tonsorial artist, I found that he added some blue color to his customer's hair, or that he cut it in a unique design. Thaddeus may have used some of these practices that were not traditionally used in Lancaster City. Thaddeus's shop moved about 10 different locations during the 60 years that he was in business in downtown Lancaster. It was often located next to hotels or on busy streets. He served many prominent Lancastrians, such as President James Buchanan, Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, publisher James W. Forney, and many other doctors, lawyers, and judges. They spoke highly of him and chose him as their favorite barber. He cut hair, trimmed or shaved beards, and even manicured wigs. He sold fancy soaps, colognes, and dentifrices, and that's just tooth care products. He served both male and female clients. Publisher James Forney was also an amateur actor at the Chestnut Street Theater, and that was there before the Fulton Opera House was built. My great-great-grandfather was the makeup artist for him and for other actors. Thaddeus may have had Black customers. If he did, he never served them at his downtown shops. All of his customers were white. White people would not go to the same barbershop that served Black people. My great-great-grandfather had 7 children, 2 boys and 5 girls. His sons Benjamin and Thaddeus Jr., my great-grandfather, served in the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War. Benjamin is buried in the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church Cemetery. Thaddeus is buried in the Stevens Greenland Cemetery for colored people. They fought for freedom, justice, and equality in the war, but were still forced to be segregated at death for their burial. Thaddeus S. Henry died on May 16, 1897. This was written in the obituary, in his obituary in the Lancaster newspaper. The oldest barber and the best known colored resident of the city. In pursuit of his vocation, he was eminently successful. By his genteel nature, he made and retained many friends. It will be a good thing if it can be said about you in your later days that you were successful in your trade or career or profession that you had chosen, and that you had many friends and had kept them through your life. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kathleen, for sharing your family's history and their story. Although Henry was a free Black man, many other Blacks were still enslaved. Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith were helping to abolish it. Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith were influential people. He, a politician, she, a businesswoman in the city of Lancaster. He was a white man and she was at that time called a mulatto, a person of mixed race. We now use the term biracial. Together, Stephen and his housekeeper, Lydia Hamilton Smith, went on to become strident abolitionists who fed and clothed freedom seekers who passed through Lancaster on their way north. Around 1835, the time that the Black women escaped from the workhouse and jail, Thaddeus Stevens was working tirelessly to be sure that the laws of the state of Pennsylvania would continue to provide money for schools so that all children could receive an education. He also became an advocate for giving women the right to vote. This is possibly because of his association with Lydia Hamilton Smith, a woman of color and native of Gettysburg. A widowed Mrs. Smith moved to Lancaster with her two sons and became Stephen's housekeeper in the 1840s. From his letter, we learn that he spoke of her as an equal and discussed the political issues of the day. She managed his financial affairs, cared for Stephen's nephews, who also lived in his home, and managed his property. In 1848, when he was running for his first term in the United States Congress, he and Mrs. Smith sheltered freedom seekers, feeding them and sending them on to the next safe house to the east. Ruins from the area where freedom seekers may have hidden exist today at the property. Historians tell us that Smith bought a lot at 21 East Vine Street, constructed a building, and may have used it as her first boarding house from which she could earn an income. She also owned a boarding home in Washington, D.C. Boarding homes were places where people could sleep, they were places where people could sleep and eat meals that were prepared for them. It is possible that she used her properties as safe houses. In a time when women were denied the right to vote and custom excluded them from most professions, Mrs. Smith became a successful businesswoman, overcoming all odds. Mrs. Smith was born on Valentine's Day in 1815 and died on Valentine's Day in 1884. Mr. Stevens served as Lancaster's congressman in Washington, D.C. As an abolitionist and an agent of the Underground Railroad, he passionately opposed slavery. At the Civil War that forced a violent and bloody end to slavery, Thaddeus Stevens worked alongside others to make changes or amendments to our Constitution so that all people would be treated equally and slavery could not return. Please note that the X has been removed from the scroll to indicate that this series of laws gave justice and equality to Black people in the United States. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction in 1865. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to Black people so that now everyone, white or Black, was protected by law from cruelty and injustice. This amendment finally ended the power of the fugitive slave laws. After Stephen's death, the 15th Amendment was passed. It gave Black men the right to vote. Free Black men had this right after the Revolutionary War in some parts of Pennsylvania, but discriminatory legislation took away that right in 1834. In 1920, white women earned the right to vote, but Black women faced more obstacles because of oppressive laws. While some Black women were allowed to vote in 1965, others were disenfranchised for several more years. Even after slavery ended and citizenship for Black people was guaranteed, control through discrimination and oppression continued. Even though those amendments were laws, they were not enforced. After the Civil War in 1877, people tried to rebuild the southern part of the United States. This was called Reconstruction. Formerly enslaved Black people who were now free were looking for better jobs and a voice in their own government. Because this was seen as a threat to white people, the legislatures in the southern states began to write and pass Jim Crow laws. The term Jim Crow was borrowed from musical shows in which white performers painted their faces Black so that they could ridicule Black people. These laws reinforced segregation and allowed and encouraged white people to treat Black people harshly and inhumanely. Jim Crow traditions made it a crime for Black people and white people to be together, and this restriction adversely affected the job opportunities open to African Americans. The job of hide carried was a common occupation for Black men in Lancaster. Because of Jim Crow laws requiring segregation in the workplace, Black men and women were not allowed to have highly skilled jobs. Those were reserved for white people. The custom of limiting Black people to dirty, back-breaking work like hod carriers continued into the 1950s and 1960s. Black people who were lucky to find a job received the lowest pay, under $1 per hour. In great numbers, African American men left the South to take jobs in quarries, foundries, railroads, and the building industry. Occupations available, particularly to women, were housemaids and cooks. In this social and economic environment of Jim Crow, it's amazing and impressive to realize the determination and grit that it took for African Americans to succeed.
Another African American who overcame obstacles was our time guide and pilot, Emery Conrad Malick. His great niece, Mary Gross, is here to talk with you about his achievement of becoming the first African American to reach so high. Please welcome Mary Gross.
Hello. As a young man, Emery lived in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, where he worked as a farmhand, carpenter, and pioneer builder and flyer of gliders and biplanes. Emery refined his trade and talents in the early 1900s when he and his father, Darius, my great-grandfather, also a carpenter, helped build the Capitol building in Harrisburg and also installed mahogany veneering in the dining and sleeping cars for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Because of his love for flying machines, his determination and perseverance, Emery Malick became an African-American pioneer in aviation. Being a Black man, this was a magnificent achievement, as unjust laws and discrimination were still embedded in our communities. Here in Lancaster, he also garnered a lot of attention. Emery Conrad Malick was the first aviator to fly over central Pennsylvania in 7 Points, Northumberland County, in 1911. By August of 1912, he was flying in air shows over Lancaster out of Rocky Springs Park. His fellow flyer, J.B. McCallie from Harrisburg, was given top billing. However, the loudest cheers from the crowd came after Malick stepped out of his airplane after his flight. He later earned his international pilot's license on North Island in San Diego while attending the Curtis School of Aviation. Malick's FAI license number 105 was issued on March 20th, 1912, making him the first licensed Black pilot in the world. Malick was also the first African American to earn a federal transport license, number 1716, on April 30th, 1927, and a federal airplane mechanics license, number 924. Sadly, he was grounded as a pilot in 1928 after sustaining eye injuries from a plane crash in Woodbury, New Jersey. Let's look where he worked in Lancaster. In 1910, before he earned his license, Emery Malick lived and worked as house carpenter at the Hotel Weber, also known as the Leopard Hotel, in a building still there at 105-107 East King Street in downtown Lancaster. From Lancaster, he moved to Philadelphia, working as a barnstormer, flying passengers for the Flying Dutchman Air Service and working as a pilot for aerial photography companies like the Aero Service Corps and Dallin Aerial Surveys. Like many people today, having many skills and talents to earn a living, Mr. Malick also worked as an airplane mechanic, a carpenter, and master tile layer. Emery Malick never forgot his time in Lancaster. According to a local historian and his friend, a nonagenarian, Ralph Murray, Emery returned to Lancaster during the 1930s to visit with his friends in the African American community. I hadn't known anything about Great Uncle Emery until 2004, 46 years after he died. That year, I uncovered many photos and articles about him that were stashed away in an old box in my cousin's attic. With the help of my daughter and web designer, Susanna Sulik, I created a website about Emery and wrote several books, and Cora's Wart, a historical fairy tale, and Lila tells the story of Emery Conrad Malick, our first licensed Black pilot. And I'm still working on his biography as well. Emery Conrad Malick will now be included in the Black Pioneers of Flight exhibit in the newly renovated National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Mary, for introducing us to Mr. Malick.
It's a pleasure.
Next, people a little closer to Earth heard the call to community service. Please think about how these people from Lancaster were part of the new Underground Railroad. African Americans, with the advent of public transportation had the ability to travel freely, but obstacles were on every road. Motels and hotels in Lancaster closed their doors to people of color because of discrimination. However, three of Lancaster's families welcomed these travelers into their homes, giving them refuge, a safe place to sleep, rest, and eat. Laura Carter can be considered to have continued the ideals of the Underground Railroad as she opened her home to travelers who were not welcome in Lancaster because of the color of their skin. She provided traveling African Americans food and a place to rest. She and her husband, James, lived at 143 South Duke Street, and it was a safe house. Laura Carter would have felt and experienced the pain of segregation and discrimination of Jim Crow traditions. In 1917, civic-minded African Americans, including Laura Carter and Abraham Polite, whose story is coming soon, honored the memory of Thaddeus Stevens, who, through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, abolished slavery, granted citizenship to African Americans, and gave Black men the right to vote. Mrs. Carter died in 1940, but African Americans continue her legacy of community service. How are Mr. and Mrs. Carter similar to agents of the Underground Railroad? Reverend F.M. Webster conceived the idea of a Negro Civic League to promote the interests of local Black people in the city. The Negro Civic League in Lancaster helped African Americans achieve social, economic, political, and educational equality. Mrs. Carter served as president of the Negro Civic League in its early years. The Negro Civic League became the Crispus Attucks Community Center. Another civil rights organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, has a branch in Lancaster that has been serving the community for 97 years. Now we will meet a couple whose roots gave birth to another version of the Underground Railroad. Please welcome Nelson Polite, Jr., who will share his story.
Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you about Abraham Lawrence Polite Sr. He was born in 1874 at Ridgeland, South Carolina. He journeyed from the South to Philadelphia. He worked in a cigar shop, and then he ventured on to Lancaster. And I would assume that he came to Lancaster for one of the reasons because he was dealing with cigars and tobacco. And at that time, Lancaster was certainly one of the capital locations of the East Coast for tobacco. He married Mildred Blanche Richardson Polite. They raised 5 children at 540 North Street. One of those children, the second to the youngest, is my father. His name was Nelson M. Polite Sr. My grandfather, Abram Polite, was involved in a lot of civic organizations and community activities. He was also one of the founders of the Crispus Attucks. He also was the last sitting president of the Negro Civic League, which ushered in the NAACP. His first love and focus was certainly family. All of his children were certainly successful and good citizens. And then he certainly was extremely involved with the church. He was a superintendent for approximately 26 years. He was the choir director for about 50 years. So that really kept him very, very grounded. But he, as traveling himself, coming up from the South, he was well aware of the difficulties that Black people had in staying in different locations. So he joined the Green Book by Hugo Green, was the founder of it. And that Green Book really ran between 1936 and 1966. So he was able to house those travelers that were traveling to and fro as they came through Lancaster City. What I remember is, our house was always an open house, and there was always people coming and going. Very, very open and welcoming home. As he got up in years, one of the stories that I do remember of him, he lived to be 94 years old, and several people many people knew him throughout the city, both whether it be political or civic or church, law enforcement, many folks knew him. But my father would hide his coat because he wasn't supposed to be out walking and, traveling to and fro. And he would get very angry about that. But he just always wanted to go and be involved. So I definitely do remember that. In closing, he and the family stood for integrity, character, compassion, and perseverance. That's how I would describe himself and the things that he passed on to not only his children, but also his grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson, for sharing your story.
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Reva Sims opened her home to Black students studying at Bowman Technical School, where they learned to make and repair watches and clocks. Mrs. Sims' service to the students gave them an opportunity to get an education, when many other people closed their doors to them. Mrs. Sims also rented rooms to Black baseball players from 1950 to 1960. Two baseball players from the Lancaster Red Roses baseball minor league baseball team, Lou Johnson and Lou Jackson, were guests in her home. Lou Johnson went on to play for the Los Angeles Dodgers, the Chicago Cubs, the Cleveland Indians, the Milwaukee Brewers, and the California Angels. Lou Jackson went on to play for the Chicago Cubs, Baltimore Orioles, and then to Japanese baseball. Mrs. Sims' grandson is Gerald Wilson, a volunteer in Lancaster's African American Historical Society. Mrs. Sims had 4 children, 2 who went on to become detectives with the Lancaster Police Department. Sports became a road to success for another African American pioneer, Barney Ewell.
Barney Ewell was considered to be in the prime of his athletic career when, because of the World War II, the 1940 and 1944 Olympic Games were canceled. However, when the Olympic Games were finally held in 1948, Ewell was 30 years old and considered to be a grandfather in the sport. At those games in London, he brilliantly won a gold medal in the 400 relay and 2 silver medals for winning the 100 and 200-yard dash. These events occurred before our next speaker, his daughter, Denise Ewell, was born. She will talk about her memories of her father. Please welcome Denise.
Hi, I'd like to say hello to everyone and take a moment to say thank you for this opportunity to share some precious memories about my father. In the one photo, it shows him with his athletic uniform from McCaskey after he won so many awards, and those are just a few. When my father graduated in 1938 from McCaskey High School, there were only 2 Blacks in his class, and he was one of them. In 1988, the stadium at McCaskey was dedicated in his honor. And that same year, my father, Barney Ewell, was inducted into the McCaskey Hall of Fame. Also, on the outside of the McCaskey High School building, there's a marker, a historical marker that was placed in his honor in 2018. In the one photo here, it says in 1940, Ewell was named fastest man on earth when he broke the world record for 50-yard dash. And I just am still at awe, never witnessing or seeing my father run, but just in awe, knowing that he at one time was deemed the fastest man on earth. However, World War II disrupted my father's education. He postponed his 1942 graduation from Penn State so that he could enlist in the US Army in 1941. When they asked my father what division of the Army he wanted to be in, he jokingly said, and I quote, "Anyone but the cavalry, because if we get into trouble, I have to run and I don't want the horses to get in my way." He served with distinction until 1945 and returned to competition in college and graduated with a degree in physical education from Penn State in 1947.
Thank you, Denise, for telling us
Oh.
your father's story.
Denise, go ahead.
Furthermore, in 1948, that's when my father won 2 silvers and 1 gold. And the picture that is displayed on the upper right-hand corner is with him and Prince Philip, who died this year, Queen Elizabeth's husband, which he was also called the Duke of Edinburgh. It's just another totally awesome feat for my father, for this pioneering Black man. However, after the Olympics, the city of Lancaster recognized my father with a parade around August of 1948. Also, the city gave him a house and a car. But the track authorities made it clear that by accepting these gifts, Barney Ewell was classified as a professional athlete. Therefore, my father was barred from any further Olympic competition. But did this stop him? Of course not. He went on to compete in competitions and was immensely popular in Australia, New Zealand, England, and Scotland. Actually, when Barney Ewell competed abroad, some of these places had never seen a Black man. On August 13, 2019, the mayor of Lancaster and the city council passed a resolution to name a section of downtown in his honor, which was a long, long and difficult process. When it came down to it actually naming a section, at first there were some that wanted to name it Yule Olympic Plaza. But however, myself, along with my brother and my daughter, just said, hey, why don't we just name it Yule Plaza? You wonder why? Well, Barney's Yule's reach, my father, extended beyond the field of track. This goes for past, present, and future generations because he represents the breadth of humanity, regardless of race, creed, color, nationality, or culture. He was perseverant, the perseverance, that he displayed. It just didn't come by just him idling around or sitting on his laurels. It came with a lot of sweat to overcome the odds. He overcame polio and was determined to prove that he still had the right stuff at the age of 30 to achieve in the Olympics, to overcome certain racial adversities, which is why his legacy is such a powerful representation for all to appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I must admit, there are so many facts and interesting things that your dad did with so much given. I got so excited, I was ready to thank you halfway in between. Right now, I really
Thank you.
thank you for telling us your father's story.
Thank you.
In our presentation today, we have heard only a few stories of the many African Americans whose perseverance, grit, determination, and faith spirited them through obstacles they encountered day by day. We honor them and their achievements by educating ourselves through their stories. Thank you, everyone, for spending this time with us. Let's take a moment to review what we've learned.
Throughout this program, many slides displayed a symbol of a dollar sign. What did that symbol mean?
Black entrepreneurs and pioneers contributed to the wealth and prosperity of Lancaster County, the state of Pennsylvania, and the nation.
What did this symbol mean?
Black women and men marched forward with determination and perseverance.
What do you recall about the scroll with the X?
Unjust laws perpetuated the cruelty to people of African descent. These laws included the 1780 Act of Gradual Abolition, the 1793 and 1850 fugitive slave laws. In 1850, the Dred Scott decision, and for 100 years, the Jim Crow laws, 1865 to 1960.
Please share your ideas about what the clasping hands could represent.
The clasping hands symbol represents that Black and white people work together to achieve justice and equality for people of African descent. The best examples occurred in these stories. The story of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad when Whipper and Smith built secret compartments in their railroad cars. The story of Sheriff Daredevil Dave Miller, allowing the 2 Black women to escape from the jail after they were kidnapped by slave catchers. The story of the spies for Thaddeus Stevens. And Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith sheltering and feeding freedom seekers and sending them on to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. African American Heritage Walking Tours are offered the first Saturday every month, May through November. You and your family are welcome to attend. Please visit our website for information. To make a donation, please visit our website or mail a check to the address on the slide. We thank everyone who has helped to create and present Overcoming the Odds. Thank you for joining us today.